In 1888, the East End of London was defined by extreme poverty and severe overcrowding. Just steps away from the wealthiest square mile on Earth, the alleys of Whitechapel packed thousands of workers into a few blocks of unsanitary, desperate conditions. The women remembered today as the canonical 5 victims, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, lived within this daily struggle for survival. They were real, vulnerable individuals, navigating systemic neglect and an environment that offered them almost no protection. Between August and November of that year, absolute terror descended on this poorly lit district. Brutal killings triggered outright panic in the streets. A densely packed, undocumented population living in near total darkness created an environment where violence could be hidden in plain sight. In 1888, Whitechapel offered the perfect cover for a killer to operate, and for an investigation to get lost in the shadows. Over 130 years later, we still have absolutely no idea who committed these crimes. Despite generating the most studied murder investigation in human history, the identity of the killer remains a total blank. The vacuum of evidence has allowed theorists to point fingers at almost anyone. The suspect list has swelled to include local butchers, transient sailors, cotton merchants, and even members of the British royal family. Modern observers frequently assume the killer must have been a criminal genius to evade capture. That projects modern forensic expectations onto a Victorian reality. The Whitechapel murderer escaped because the police of 1888 were effectively hunting blindfolded in a labyrinth. The men tasked with finding the killer belonged to the Metropolitan and City of London police forces. Constables and inspectors like Frederick Aberline patrolled the streets on foot, relying entirely on their eyes, ears, and local informants. This timeline shows the massive gap between the 1888 investigation and modern crime-solving tools. Fingerprinting was 12 years away, blood typing 27. DNA forensics wouldn't exist for a century. The police had zero concept of biological tracking. Compounding this lack of technology was a complete absence of crime scene protocol. Murder sites were rarely secured. Local residents, journalists, and beat cops freely walked through the alleys where bodies were found, contaminating whatever physical traces might have been left behind. Without secure perimeters or biological tools, the physical evidence strictly required to tie a suspect to a crime in court was destroyed before the investigation could even officially begin. Investigators had to rely entirely on analog methods. They sketched the locations, made careful observations of the bodies, and interviewed more than 2,000 lodging house residents in a desperate attempt to find a lead. Medically trained coroners provided the closest thing to a suspect profile. Because the victims sustained precise mutilations, coroners inferred the killer had anatomical knowledge. This forced the police to pivot their search toward local slaughterhouses, hospitals, and doctors' offices. Realizing they could not solve the murders after the fact, the police shifted their focus to prevention. They set traps, hoping to catch the killer in the act.
Constables attached rubber to the soles of their boots to walk quietly through the cobbled streets. In an attempt to act as decoys, some officers even dressed as prostitutes, though many notoriously refused to shave off their regulation mustaches for the assignment. They experimented with animal tracking, bringing in bloodhounds named Barnaby and Burgo to follow scent trails across London parks. These erratic tactics reveal a police force completely aware of its own limitations. Lacking the science to link a suspect to a past event, their only viable strategy was a red-handed arrest. And that strategy failed. The investigation faced a fatal roadblock, the aggressive birth of mass media. In 1888, daily newspapers realized that graphic murder coverage resulted in massive sales. At the end of September, a news agency received a confession signed with a catchy moniker. Modern experts and police at the time largely agree this Dear Boss letter was fabricated by a journalist, trying to keep a highly profitable story in the headlines. Publishing the name Jack the Ripper triggered an operational disaster. The police received an avalanche of over 300 similar letters and postcards, forcing inspectors to waste thousands of hours chasing manufactured leads. Internal politics actively sabotaged the remaining evidence. After a piece of a victim's apron was found near a chalked message on Golston Street, Metropolitan Police Commissioner Charles Warren hastily ordered the writing erased before it could be photographed, fearing it would spark anti-Semitic riots. By wiping the wall clean, Warren destroyed one of the only potential pieces of physical evidence located directly on the killer's escape route. The Metropolitan Police were battling an insurmountable wave of manufactured misinformation and internal bureaucratic panic. The facts of the case were buried under a profitable fiction, and then the murders simply stopped. The ferocity of the attacks escalated through November and then ceased, leaving investigators to chase shadows. Whitechapel's enormous, undocumented population meant the perpetrator could simply vanish. With no central criminal records, an individual easily disappeared without leaving a single paper trail. The tragedy did yield one tangible societal outcome. The relentless press coverage forced wealthy Londoners to finally look closely at the severe deprivation occurring right on their doorstep. The media's focus on the killings forced a public reckoning with the East End's living conditions. This exposure eventually led to long overdue housing reforms and a major shift in how the city treated its poorest districts. Today, the East End is almost unrecognizable. The notorious slum dwellings and dark alleys of 1888 are now highly sought-after million-pound residences. The man who committed the murders was likely an ordinary local resident. He evaded capture by operating in a vast geographical and scientific blind spot. Deep urban poverty, the absolute infancy of forensic science, and aggressive interference from the press created the perfect conditions for a killer to escape consequences. The investigation was trapped between a lack of science and a surplus of media hype. We are left with the legacy of a name, a signature likely written by a reporter that turned 5 unsolved crimes into an enduring legend.